everyone, my name is Lauren Cleveland and this is the video tutorial companion to the Cleo cowl neck top sewing pattern. The Cleo cowl neck top is, as you can see, of course, a cowl neck, pretty classic shape, I would say. It does have darts running from the apex of the bust to the waistline of the shirt, and in the back of the garment you can see we have some ties crisscrossing across the back and tying in the middle to secure the garment. In this tutorial, I'm going to be making the Cleo cowl neck top in a size 6 because that's closest to my size, but the pattern itself includes sizes 0 through 20. When you're deciding what size to make for yourself, I strongly recommend going off of your bust measurement. And to take your bust measurement, you're going to want to measure yourself all the way around, overlapping with the widest part of your bust, commonly referred to as the apex. In a lot of women, this is where your nipple is, but not for everybody. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to complete this top from the very beginning all the way to the very end, including assembling the paper pattern, cutting out all the fabric pieces that you need, and assembling the garment using your sewing machine. This pattern is extremely beginner friendly and only requires a simple straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. So if you don't have a fancy machine, there's no problem at all. For this particular Cleo cowl neck top, I used some thrifted fabric. So truthfully, I don't know exactly what it is comprised of, but it does kind of feel like a cotton or some sort of cotton blend. It has a little bit of a stiffness to it. It's not overly soft like a polyester or a polyester blend might be, and the grain in the fabric is very visible. I've also made this top with a thrifted bedsheet, which is of course a little bit more silky, a little thinner. Honestly, I would love to see this top made in quite a variety of fabrics. I think it could work well in a lot of different fabrics. So I don't necessarily have a recommendation for what you should use to make this top, but I will say if you are a true beginner and this is one of the first more complex projects that you're going to attempt, I would recommend choosing a fabric that is a little bit stiffer, something that's not going to shift around on you too much due to the nature of creating a cowl neck and having the fabric cut on the bias. It already makes the top prone to weebling, wobbling, shifting all around, right? So maybe don't use something too silky or soft if you are a true beginner. This is now the second pattern that I've finished for Lauren Cleveland patterns. I love this top mostly because I love a cowl neck personally. I love the volume and interesting shape that it brings to a garment. And I think this top is a great option, not only for beginners, but just generally in sewing, because there is quite a bit of room for error on the sizing. With the back of the top obviously being a tie, there is room for adjustments after the garment is complete, tying it tighter or looser to suit whatever is most comfortable or looks best on your figure. The first thing you should do after printing out the pattern is verify that it was printed at the correct size by measuring the test square in the upper left-hand corner of the first page of the pattern. Once you've verified that the pattern has been printed at the correct sizing, you can begin assembling it using just some clear tape and office scissors. Use the boxes and circles on the pattern to help you align the pages correctly. The rows of the pattern pages are represented by letters, and the columns are represented by numbers. Next, we're going to prepare to cut our first pattern piece by laying out our fabric where it is folded on the bias. This basically means that the fold of your fabric should be at a 45-degree angle in relation to the grain line or cross grain of the fabric. This can be a little bit tricky to lay flat due to the nature of it being folded on the bias, but just take your time and use your pins, pattern weights, and maybe even your iron as necessary. Once you've got your fabric folded on the bias and pinned in place as needed, you're going to lay pattern piece A with the straight center front running along the fold of your fabric. Using pattern weights or something similar, weigh piece A down and use your water-soluble marker, chalk, or something similar to trace around the pattern piece. Once you've done this, remove your pattern weights and you're going to flip pattern piece A over to the other side. Once flipped, you need to align the center straight front with the fold of your fabric once again. Essentially, we're going to be making one large symmetrical version of piece A. Once you have the pattern piece in place and weighed down with your pattern weights, trace it again with your marker or chalk, remove the pattern piece. I recommend adding a bunch more pins all around the fabric just to really ensure it's not going to move around on you as you're doing these next few steps. Now that we've traced what we need to for pattern piece A, we're going to add our seam allowance. I strongly recommend that you use a clear sewing ruler to do this step, and my preferred seam allowance is a 1/2 inch, but you can really make it whatever you're comfortable with. Go ahead and draw in that seam allowance along all edges. You do not need to add seam allowance inside of your dart, as we're going to be sewing that together anyways. Once you've added in that seam allowance, you're going to cut it out of your fabric. I personally recommend using a rotary cutter for this pattern. With using a rotary cutter versus fabric scissors, you can avoid picking up the fabric and shifting it around more than you need to. Once you have pattern piece A cut out of your fabric, we're going to go ahead and flip that right over onto the other side. The reason we're doing this is because we are going to realign our pattern piece with the fabric and mark the darts on the other side as well. The best way to align the pattern piece with this other side is to mark straight across the neckline and then aligning pattern piece A with the neckline that you just created and the fold of the fabric. You may have to play around with the fabric, pulling and prodding at it just a little bit if it doesn't seem like the seam allowance is matching up correctly with the paper pattern piece. Once you feel like you have it in a good spot, weigh that pattern piece down with your pattern weights again and minimally trace the dart. I recommend that you trace around the entirety of the pattern piece. Repeat this same process on the other side of your fabric by flipping your pattern piece once again. Now we're going to cut out pattern piece B. For this piece, we need 4, 2 left and 2 right. So the best way that I recommend approaching this step is by simply folding your fabric twice over so that you essentially have 4 layers on top of one another. Keep in mind that we're going to be cutting this piece out with the grain line, so you're not going to be folding your fabric in the same way that you just did for pattern piece A. Once you have your fabric folded and that paper pattern piece laying on the fabric in the intended direction, you can either weigh it down with pattern weights or pin it right in place, which is something that I like to do sometimes. I just stick the pin right through the paper and through the fabric to hold it all in place and trace the outline of that pattern piece. Then, just like we did with pattern piece A, we're going to add our desired seam allowance along all edges. Go ahead and cut that out, and once finished, you should have 4 pieces of the same shape. Of course, only one of those pieces will have the pattern piece outline on it, so just take that paper pattern piece and align it on the remaining 3 fabric pieces to draw out where you're going to be doing those stitch lines. Pattern pieces C and D do not require you to add seam allowance. So once you have those traced, just go ahead and cut out that rectangle. My personal recommendation for doing pattern piece C is to cut it on folded fabric. This just makes for half as much marking and cutting. Fold pattern piece C in half and then align that folded edge with the folded edge of your fabric. You can mark it with your water-soluble marker or chalk, then cut, or you can just feel free to go right in with that rotary cutter and cut it out right off the bat. The next thing we're going to do is sew our darts closed. It's important that you fold them in a way where the lines of each side are aligning almost perfectly with one another. To do this, I recommend using your pins as a guide. So what I mean by this is kind of stick your pin through one side of the dart on the line and then take a look at the other side and see where that point poked through the fabric. If it's not quite in alignment with the other side of the dart, shift your fabric around and try adjusting your pin until it is poking through on the other side where it's crossing over that line. It's a little bit difficult for me to articulate, but I'm hoping that you can get an understanding of what I mean by watching what I'm doing in the video. Then once you feel like you've got that dart folded right down the middle, go ahead and take it over to your iron and press it in place. Then once your dart is folded, pressed, and ready to go, take that over to your sewing machine and set it to the straight stitch setting. Now starting at the bottom or the wider part of the dart, sew along your dart line all the way to the tip and finish the dart by sewing right off of your fabric. Once you stopped your machine, you're going to want to pull the thread so that you have a little bit of length to allow yourself to tie your thread in a knot at that point of the dart. I do not recommend backstitching at the point of a dart because I just feel like you can get a much cleaner finish by sewing right off the fabric and then manually tying the threads. Once you have all your darts sewn in place, you're going to want to take them over to your iron and press them away from the center front of the garment. Now we're going to move on to pieces C and D, and we're going to want to fold those both long ways and press them in place. Once you have those pressed, we're going to take them over to our machine and we're going to stitch along that long edge about 1/8 of an inch away from that raw edge. Once you make it to the other end of the piece, stop your stitch with your needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot and turn the piece 90 degrees. Put your presser foot back down and finish your stitch closing off the tube. Now before the next step, you're going to want to take your fabric scissors and just snip off the very corner of that piece. Basically what this is going to do is take some of that bulk out of what will eventually be the inside of this tube. Next, you're going to want to take your loop turner or similar tool. A safety pin can work as well, though I think it's going to pose a much greater challenge for you, especially if you're a beginner. But take that loop turner or other tool and we're going to turn those two tubes that we made out of pieces C and D right side out. Next, we're going to stitch our B pieces to piece A. So go ahead and align the long edge of piece B with the side seam of piece A. Pin these right sides together and straight stitch right up along that side seam. Take it over to your iron and press those seams open. Fold piece D in half and cut it right down the middle. These are going to be our two loops in the back of the top that we thread our long straps through. We're going to want to fold piece A at the neckline. Make sure that the bottom hem, the armholes, the side seams are all aligning. Take it over to your iron and press it down. We're going to start pinning in our straps and loops. Take one of your long straps or one of your C pieces and place it in between the two layers of your folded piece A, with the raw end aligning with the flat area between the neckline and the armhole. So you want to make sure that that C piece is aligned with the outer corner, and we will eventually address that excess fabric. Now we're going to do a similar thing with one of our D pieces, which is the loop. The main difference is that we are pinning this piece in place folded, whereas the long strap or C we did not fold. Once again, align the raw edges of this loop with the outside edge of your main garment. Then go ahead and pin together the rest of the garment from the armholes to the side seams. Take it over to your machine and stitch along your seam allowance all the way around, crossing the stitch over those loops and straps that you just pinned in place, but not sewing along the neckline. Next, we're going to really secure those straps and loops in place by doing a zigzag stitch on the part of the strap or loop that is aligned with our seam allowance. So go ahead and switch your machine over to a zigzag stitch and just go back and forth maybe 2 or 3 times in that area, really securing that strap or loop so that when it is inevitably pulled on when you're wearing the garment, it's less likely to tear at the stitch. Now we're going to address that excess fabric next to where we sewed our C-strap. All we're going to do here is fold over that excess. At this point in time, it doesn't really matter which side is the front or back of your garment. The only thing to keep in mind is that whichever direction you fold it, you're going to want to do it in the same direction on the opposite side. Then just take those over to your machine and use a straight stitch to stitch those in place. Pin along the entire hem of the garment, ensuring that both sides are aligning perfectly. Something you want to keep in mind is the placement of the darts and the center seam. Make a conscious effort to ensure that these points are aligning with the same point on the other side. Once you have that all pinned in place, take it over to your machine and sew along the hem almost all the way across, but leaving maybe 2 inches open at the end. Before we turn our garment right side out, we need to add some cuts to our seam allowance that will allow those seams to sit nice and flat. Go ahead and add some snips to the seam allowance of the curved arm area, getting relatively close to the stitch, but being very careful not to cut through it. Then you also want to go to the corners of the garment and just take off some of that excess. Once you've done all the necessary snipping, we're going to turn our piece right side out. I recommend doing this by sticking your thumb or other finger through that opening that you left and trying to find the strap on the opposite shoulder of the garment. Start by pulling that through the hole and then gently but firmly coax the rest of it through. Once you have that turned right side out, we're going to close the opening. This is very simple but can be somewhat tedious sometimes. Basically, you're just going to make sure that seam allowance is pressed inside of the garment and just finagle it into a position where the fold is aligning with the rest of the hem of the garment. Press it, pin it in place, and then bring it over to your machine to do a top stitch. You want to keep this top stitch as close to the edge as you possibly can or feel comfortable with. I try to go about maybe 1/8 from the edge of my fabric, but you can leave a little more distance if you're not comfortable with 1/8 or you're having trouble doing so. Now, once you have that opening closed, go ahead and bring your garment back over to the iron and take your time pressing the seams around the entire garment. Once you have all of your sides nice and pressed, we're going to top stitch around the entire garment with the exception of the neckline, very similarly to how we just did when we closed the opening. And here we have the final garment. If you purchased the pattern for the Cleo cowl neck top, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, and I truly hope you enjoyed the process. If you have any thoughts or feedback from me, please feel free to send me an email. I would love to see photos of you in the finished top once all said and done. If you feel comfortable sharing those with me, I hope I'll see you for the next one. Bye.